Good morning. Thank you for being here. You're all welcome to FITMA's inaugural lecture, as someone called it, because actually it's the first lecture of the first series of lectures, which implies that there will be at least a second one. Let me present to you first very shortly what FITMA means. It's an ERC-funded project, and it's an acronym for Fluidity in the Medieval Aristotle. So we're trying to study how fluid aspects, that means the fact that Aristotelian philosophy in the Middle Ages was transmitted in manuscript form in very many different forms, that is, how this variation, this fluidity, influenced the reception of the texts. So in our first series, we will deal with an important text for a project, that is De Anima, Aristotle's De Anima, especially the oldest translation known as the Vetus, which is a very difficult text, a very difficult translation with a very difficult transmission. So we are looking in our first series into the reception and transmission of this text, and also have one of the talks will deal with intricate transmissions of other types of text. And we couldn't have asked for a better speaker to open the series, or we couldn't have asked for a more appropriate topic. Keskiaho comes from the University of Helsinki, and he presents himself as, I quote, a researcher of early medieval history, of manuscripts, and the reception of patristic texts. In 2015, he published the monograph Dreams and Visions in the Early Middle Ages, the Reception and Use of Patristic Ideas 400-900. He also published articles about readers' annotations in manuscripts of Augustine's works, a topic that would nicely fit into the program of the second lecture series, actually. He was also involved in the Codices Fennici project, mapping medieval manuscripts in Finland. We have invited him today to talk about the topic of the monograph he is currently finishing, on ideas about the soul in the early Middle Ages, the same period as the one in his first monograph, that is 400 to 900. We're very curious. Yes.
Thank you, Peter. What was the substance of the soul? The stuff the soul was made of? And why would such questions matter? In this paper, I review how the nature of the soul was imagined from the 5th to the 9th centuries in the Latin West. I argue that before the introduction of Aristotelian ideas, the nature of the soul in the Latin West was understood in broadly two different ways. Everybody agreed that the soul was immortal and could exist independently of the body. Just about everybody also agreed that it was incorporeal. But how this incorporeality and its implications were understood varied. On the other hand, there was a Neoplatonically inspired notion, influentially introduced by Augustine of Hippo, which taught that the soul was strictly incorporeal, meaning immaterial. Thus, the soul had no mass or shape and did not extend or move in space. Consequently, the way that the soul was in the body was utterly mysterious and could not be understood as containment in spatial terms. For Augustine, this idea that the soul, created in the image of God, was absolutely immaterial in the way that God is immaterial, underpinned the right understanding of God's nature, and explained how the mind worked and how humans could have knowledge or contact with God. On the other hand, in late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, there developed a view of the soul that fit the Augustinian incorporeal soul in the theological and pastoral requirements, effectively by limiting the extent of this incorporeality. In contrast to strict incorporeality, meaning immateriality, I call this other view weak incorporeality. Yet even after everybody agreed to call the soul incorporeal, some of the concerns raised by those questioning Augustine's views endured. Some had trouble imagining that anything non-material could exist, or could be individualized if it did. Augustine's friend and correspondent Evodius were worried that the soul's incorporeality would jeopardize the continuity of individual identity after death. Surely an incorporeal soul would just merge with all other spirits. Faustus, the bishop of Riez in southern Gaul in the middle of the 5th century, similarly argued that the soul's incorporeality would mean that it was omnipresent in the way that only God truly is. Moreover, he had pastoral concerns to prefer a material soul. For if the soul was incorporeal, how could it be taken after death into places of repose or torment, just as Jesus told us would happen in his story of poor Lazarus and the rich man? On the contrary, the fact that the soul evidently had a place in the body shows that it was not immaterial, but somehow corporeal. Faustus likened the soul to other created spirits, the angels, and remarked that they too are surely corporeal. For is not hell made for the devil and his angels? And if they were not essentially corporeal and local, how could they suffer? The nature of the soul was central to ways of conceptualizing the nature of God and the order of created universe, the way the mind worked, but also deeply embedded in questions about the continuity of individual identity after death and in the ideas about afterlife. Moreover, because the soul was implicated in individual identity, it was also the center of individual morality and connected in this way to ideas of social order. The corporealist views of Faustus provoked a priest of Vienne called Claudianus Mamertus to respond in circa 471. Against Faustus, he argued that the soul was absolutely immaterial. He used and defended Augustine's ideas, but because Faustus had made the locality of the soul a central part of his argument for its corporeality, Claudianus had to take recourse into some of Augustine's Neoplatonic sources, like Porphyry. Consequently, he also went further than Augustine, arguing that the soul was non-local and therefore not really in the body. Rather, the body has to be understood to be, in a sense, in the soul, the way the creation is in God. In particular, he argued that, unlike Faustus or Evodius feared, incorporeal souls do not mix with other souls because they all differ in quality and can therefore be individualized. He also argued that the story of the rich man and Lazarus should be understood spiritually and did not indicate that afterlife spaces or souls were corporeal. In some more sweeping accounts of the soul in the Latin West, Claudianus's treatise is taken as the final victory of Augustinian ideas about the nature of the soul. On the contrary, while it is true that early medieval authors seem to have agreed to call the soul incorporeal, it is clear that this incorporeality was interpreted in a variety of ways. Claudianus's spirited and often ill-tempered treatise was anchored in a disappearing world of secular learning and appreciated for it by contemporaries like Sidonius Apollinaris. But it seems to have been intended to ridicule rather than convince, and his visions of a soul that was not really situated in the body are likely did little to ease the minds of those worried about individual cohesion. On the contrary, as scholars like Peter Brown have argued, in the post-Roman kingdoms of the West, bishops and secular elites tried to build moral stability and social cohesion on the threat of post-mortem punishment. And many agreed with Faustus that for such punishments to be credible, the soul could not be immaterial. At the same time, philosophically inspired immaterialism retained its theological usefulness. Roughly half a century later, late antique philosophical commitments famously flowered in Boethius' work. In his theological treatises, where Augustine's theology meets the author's brand of Neoplatonic metaphysics, he makes the absolute and godlike immateriality of the soul an important part of his argument against Eutychian Christology. The Eutychians wrongly thought that Christ consisted of two natures, divine and human, not in two distinct natures, as Boethius understood. They believed that the two natures could be made into one so that the constituent natures cease to be. But Boethius asserted that Christ can be of two natures in only three ways: by divinity changing into humanity, by humanity changing into divinity, or by a mixing of humanity and divinity, and argues that none of these are possible. Boethius instead argued that only substances that share underlying matter, that is, corporeal substances, can change into other substances. But God and the soul are both incorporeal substances, and therefore in Christ, his human soul was not changed into the divinity into which it was assumed. In other words, because God and the soul as incorporeals do not share any underlying matter, they cannot change into each other or be mixed. So Boethius, the philosophical theologian, found, like Augustine, theological uses for the absolute immateriality of the soul. However, Boethius was in many ways an exception among 6th century authors. His contemporary Cassiodorus, on the other hand, seems to have wished to be faithful to Augustine's ideas on the soul, but also to account for some of the concerns raised by corporealists such as Evodius and Faustus. For Cassiodorus, the incorporeality of the soul did not mean immateriality. He does explain that the soul is spiritual rather than a body, since it is not three-dimensional like all bodies are, and that its incorporeality explains its rational activities and its longing for its creator. The soul is fully in all the members of the body, and because form is a property of bodies, it does not have a form even when it is in the body. However, as also Gregory Smith has noted, Cassiodorus seems to have understood incorporeality in a comparative way. He defines spiritus as an invisible, created, immortal, and thin substance, and the soul as a simple substance with a nature of its own, unlike other spirits, thinner than air and more transparent. He excuses this last as a folksy definition, but later on describes how, when thinking, he senses the soul as something thin, light, and clear. Finally, although the soul is fully in all parts of the body, Cassiodorus is ready to place it chiefly in the head. Thus, it would seem that the incorporeal soul has a place and does not lack dimensions absolutely, only nearly so, being extremely thin, small, and light. It's still some kind of thing. Why was this? Part of it undoubtedly relates to how Cassiodorus, unlike Boethius, had no philosophical commitments, and although he had read Augustine, he did not care about the strict division, a strict definition of incorporeality as immateriality. Yet the characterizations of the soul as thin and placing it in the head also read like a response to the concerns of corporealists like Faustus regarding his fears about incorporeality implying ubiquity, or Evodius's fears about personal continuity after death. Cassiodorus's incorporeal soul is just that much more tangible as to perhaps more credibly retain its cohesion and individuality. Particularly, writing immediately after the East Roman conquest of Ravenna, he seems to have been concerned to demonstrate the moral nature of the deposed Ostrogothic regime that he had served. Accordingly, he leaned on the soul as the moral center of the human individual, securely contained in the body in order to lead it in moral action. Then, at the turn of the 7th century, Pope Gregory the Great presented an influential reinterpretation of Augustine's teaching on the soul's nature. If Cassiodorus does not appear to have thought much about afterlife, Gregory took on board the kinds of concerns Faustus and others had presented. He explicated the idea of postmortem punishments and rewards effectively in the 4th book of his Dialogues. Gregory has previously been understood to say two different things about the soul. Leslie Lockett said that Gregory, on the one hand, thought that the soul is incorporeal in the fully Augustinian sense, and on the other, told stories that implied otherwise. However, a closer look at what he says shows that Gregory, while aware of Augustine's ideas, interprets the soul's nature differently and insists that its incorporeality does not carry the kinds of implications Augustine and some others took for granted. Gregory unequivocally situates the soul in the body when he discusses its nature. In the Moralia, he observes that the way the incorporeal soul is in the body and governs it is incomprehensible, but unlike Augustine, he doesn't dwell on this incomprehensibility. In the Ezekiel homilies preached and written to the brothers of his monastery on the Caelian Hill, he uses Augustinian language, explaining how the soul is in the body, not distributed into its members, but wholly in each member and wholly in each of the senses. In Augustine's account, this refers to the way the incorporeal soul is not extended in space, but Gregory doesn't provide such information on the implications of incorporeality. To Gregory, instead, invisibility is the main attribute of the soul. In the Dialogues, he explains how the invisible soul is invisibly in the body, and in death also leaves it invisibly. In the Moralia, he similarly explains how humans consist of a visible and invisible part, and acknowledging the existence of the invisible soul, superior to the visible body, is a first step towards God. In the Dialogues, he also explains that the transcendental, uncircumscribed, and invisible God requires invisible servants, since servants must resemble their master. Thus, angels and souls are also invisible. Invisibility, moreover, functions as the main opposite of corporeality, as when Gregory explains that the invisible soul would not by its nature desire corporeal things, but because it was embodied, the senses gave it impressions about them. Gregory's lack of interest in the implications of incorporeality is most clear when he, in the Dialogues, answers his dialogue partner Peter's repeated questions about how the incorporeal soul, after death and before the resurrection of the bodies, could burn in corporeal hellfire. For Faustus, it was obvious that an incorporeal thing could not be enclosed in space, and therefore the soul had to be corporeal. Augustine similarly had to explain that the incorporeal soul could after death indeed not be taken into a corporeal hell, but rather an incorporeal one. These are not Gregory's concerns. He points out that just as the incorporeal soul is enclosed in a living body, it can, after leaving it, be enclosed by corporeal fire. Jesus' parable of the rich man and poor Lazarus should be understood to teach just that. Moreover, the devil and his angels are also incorporeal, and hell, after all, is designed for them. So if they can burn there, souls surely can too. Peter repeatedly wonders how the incorporeal soul can interact with or exist in corporeal spaces, and Gregory simply asserts that it can. He does this not by explaining it, but by referring to other equally unexplained givens, namely that the soul is enclosed in the living body and that the incorporeal devil will burn in hell. In addition to dismissing many of the implications of the soul's incorporeality, Gregory also relativizes it and introduces a new concept in the discussion, circumscription. He notes that God is transcendent, uncircumscribed, and incorporeal. In contrast, incorporeal souls and angels are circumscribed, bounded. The saints are similar to God in that they are created in the image of God, but they are not equal to him. They are similar in their blessedness, but still creatures, similar in that they have no end, but still circumscribed. Circumscription for Gregory seems to mark a clear difference between the creator and the creation. Gregory also seems to mean that the circumscribed soul has a finite shape or extension, since he elsewhere notes how the circumscribed mind cannot stretch to take in the unbounded immensity of God. Of course, circumscription is also related to time. The souls are created, so they are bound by time. In Gregory's mind, this is also very much an issue of comprehensibility. Just like words cannot be understood outside of time, a thing, species, is understood because it is circumscribed. Here, I think we can recognize one of the concerns of Evodius and Faustus, who thought that the Augustinian incorporeality of the soul would mean that it was ubiquitous or indefinite, in danger of dissolving into or mixing with other incorporeal things. By asserting that the incorporeal soul is circumscribed, Gregory seems to ease such concerns. However, beyond being circumscribed, the soul's incorporeality is in another way also different from the incorporeality of God. When explaining the soul's divinatory powers, Gregory attributes to it quasi-material properties. He explains that the spirit is by nature more mobile than the body, and further, the dying may sometimes prophesy through the soul's own power when, due to its thinness, subtilitas, it can see something that is to come. Thus, to Gregory, like to Cassiodorus, the soul's incorporeality was not strictly immateriality in the Augustinian sense. One clear reason, so obvious in Gregory's repeated insistence that the incorporeal soul can inhabit spaces and suffer, is that the sufferings of hell need to be real and believable even for disembodied souls, for the fates of the damned to serve as counterexamples to the living. Through the success of Gregory's works, this interpretation of incorporeality came to be tremendously influential in the Middle Ages. Now, leaving Gregory's world, during the pre-Carolingian early Middle Ages, ideas about the soul sometimes reflect idiosyncratic syntheses with no obvious reference to the two main ideas that I have sketched. The vision of Frankish monk Barontus in 678 or 679 is often noted for its non-standard anthropology. When in the vision, Archangel Raphael came and took his soul from his body, the angel left Barontus's spirit. Claude Carozzi drew attention to how this betrays a tripartite conception of human constitution with body, soul, and spirit. Moreover, after exiting his body through his mouth, Barontus's soul had, quote, a small head, eyes, and other members, and all the senses, but was unable to speak or move before it received a body, quote, similar to the one it left behind, made out of air. That the disembodied soul is portrayed as a small human seems to go beyond a simple need to make visible what was truly invisible. Barontus's soul, able to be grasped and carried by angels, was not the immaterial soul of Augustinian understanding without location, quantity, or quality. At the same time, it was far from simply corporeal, needing a body to fully interact with its surroundings. And as the idea about aerial bodies suggests, the narrative is far from unsophisticated. The depiction of disembodied Barontus may well have been informed by Augustinian ideas about the soul having an incorporeal similitude or corporis, an image of the body, with which it acted in dreams and visions. The undoubtedly learned author of Barontus's vision may well have agreed that the soul is, in some definition, incorporeal, and understood its disembodied state as a similitude or corporis, however concrete, as it was made out of air. The Carolingian period brought the two main interpretations of the soul's incorporeality together and attempted different syntheses of them. However, the Carolingian reforms also sharpened the social ideas about individual morality and accountability that a strong incorporealism might seem to threaten, until the two interpretations came to be debated without resolving their conflict. The political and religious projects commonly known as the Carolingian reforms brought, as is well known, from the late 8th century onwards, new focus to bear on funding of churches, organization of clerical education, and the copying of books. Charlemagne attracted scholars into his court, such as Theodulf, eventually Bishop of Orleans, and Alcuin, the head of York Cathedral School. The political theology of his reign, as formulated by these and other scholars, harkened back to the Old Testament. God had appointed the king to make sure that the people lived according to his will, and if the king did this, God would bless his reign. The reforms resulted in increased book production and scholarly activity, especially liturgical and theological literature. Well-copied and authoritative books were needed for discovering and teaching God's will. In the Carolingian period, ideas about the soul were implicated and developed in various theological debates. Scholars in and around Charlemagne's court debated the veneration of religious images and Spanish Christological ideas that were branded as adoptionism. The debate about images concerned the decisions of the Second Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 787 about the way images could function as a conduit between human and the divine. The probable author of Charlemagne's response, Theodulf, argued for a strict distinction between material things and immaterial spiritual things. Instead of material things, the mind's immaterial eye could bring an individual into contact with God. In this way, Theodulf's opposition to religious images seems to have relied on the soul's fairly strong incorporeality. The anti-adoptionist discourse also influenced ideas about the nature of the soul. This began in the late 780s or in the early 790s, this time in response to the Christological ideas of certain Spanish theologians, particularly Elipandus of Toledo and Felix of Urgell, but continued into the early 9th century, especially in the Frankish south. Elipandus and Felix thought that Christ, the Word of God, so emptied himself in the incarnation that he became in his humanity an adoptive son of God. The Carolingians, following Pope Hadrian, interpreted this as a resurgence of Nestorianism, the idea that Christ's human and divine natures are so distinct as to imply that he really included two different persons. Against what they understood as the Spanish error, the Carolingians then deployed Orthodox Christology, repeatedly asserting the unity of Christ's two natures and how this was paralleled and, it seems, conceptually validated through the unity of the two different substances, corporeal body and incorporeal soul, in single human individuals. While thus affirming the distinct natures of body and soul, such emphasis on their unity could prove resistant to ideas about the stricter incorporeality of the soul that might complicate its relationship with the body. The doctrinal debates that influenced Carolingian thought on the soul were in many ways linked directly with the Carolingian reform efforts. They were the products of newfound confidence and self-esteem, combined with a sense of rupture between an Orthodox tradition and the present. Nevertheless, these disputes reflect the spirit of reform also in other ways. Behind both doctrinal discourses, we find interpretations of the creation of humans in the image of God. This biblical teaching was connected to ideas about reform as the responsibility of the individual Christian, which the Carolingians often imagined as reaching back towards the perfection of the created image. Especially in Augustine's teaching, the image pertained specifically to the soul, to the mind, which had implications for its nature. The idea that the soul as the image of God, the idea of the soul as the image of God was also integral to one of the objects of Charlemagne's reforms, namely obtaining knowledge of God. Carolingian authors following Augustine thought that humans could know God through the soul and that knowledge of God equaled doing his will. Through this, in acting in accordance with God's will, ideas about the soul linked to Carolingian ideas about public life and order. Similarly, related to ideas of morality and order, the idea of the soul as the governor of the body, and teachings about the eternal fate that individuals might expect as the consequence of their action or inaction, are also linked to these discourses on the image of God and reform. In addition to the Bible and theological literature, the scholars working for Charlemagne also rediscovered several late antique texts of philosophical orientation. These included a few of Boethius's translations of Aristotle's works and his commentaries, his De Consolatione Philosophiae, and his theological treatises, Porphyry's Isagoge, Macrobius's commentary to the Dream of Scipio, Chalcidius's partial translation and commentary to Plato's Timaeus, and Priscian's Institutiones, which applied Neoplatonic philosophy to grammar, as well as Claudianus Mamertus's De Statu Anime. Such works could in time deeply influence medieval school curricula, and they also carried ideals about the nature of the soul. Through these, some Carolingian scholars became aware of some of the philosophical background to Augustine's ideas on the soul and its immateriality. From Boethius's Consolation, the theological treatises, and his De Arithmetica, they would read about how everything is either incorporeal or incorporeal. These works taught that souls were originally intellectibilia and have become intelligibilia in their fallen bodies. And that both intellectibilia and intelligibilia are incorporeal, invisible, intangible, and immutable, while incorporeals attached to corporeal things like geometrical abstractions are mutable. These works also communicated the hierarchical order of genera and the cosmos. Known from around the middle of the 9th century onwards, Boethius' elementary commentary to Porphyry's Isagoge would then explain many of these same ideas, and also how incorporeals precede corporeals so that corporeals can be derived from incorporeals. A genus is incorporeal because it holds incorporeals. Yet a deeper understanding of the way that strict incorporeality functioned to support ontological and dialectical analysis, as well as model arguments for the soul's incorporeality and its immobility in space, would only become available in the 10th century when Boethius' second commentary to the Perihermeneias and his logical textbooks started circulating. At the time, it seems that Augustine was studied more comprehensively and widely than in the pre-Carolingian period. Charlemagne's court scholars also discovered an earlier short treatise on the soul as the image of God, based on the work of Augustine and Claudianus, called De Dignitate Conditionis Humanae. This text taught that the immaterial soul governs the body non-locally, like God non-locally governs the world. Claudianus's treatise came to the Carolingians with an excerpt from a letter by Faustus, outlining his views against which Claudianus argued and also furnished with annotations that helpfully underlined key aspects of his arguments. The court copy of Chalcidius's translation and commentary was also annotated. Chalcidius's commentary provides a doxography on the soul, including an account of Aristotle's idea of the soul as the form of the living body. Quote, the first perfection of a natural organic body having the potential of life. Chalcidius interprets Aristotle as teaching that the soul is no material thing, but rather an intelligible thing, lacking dimension. Yet he criticizes Aristotle for teaching that the soul is a special substance, as he understands, and an accidental property of bodies, when it really is an intelligible thing, wholly uncontaminated by bodies. This, interestingly, is about as much as an early medieval scholar could know about Aristotle's views before the translations. Chalcidius instead opted for Plato's definition of the soul as, quote, a rational substance lacking a body and moving itself. He defends Plato against charges of inconsistency for teaching in the Phaedrus that the soul is simple and in the Timaeus that it has parts, by explaining that this division is not essential but purely analytical. In their journey back towards their celestial origin, human souls undergo a cycle of deaths and rebirths, where their actions determine if they reincarnate as higher or lower beings, although Chalcidius underlines that humans would only reincarnate as humans, not as lower animals. The copied annotations draw attention to Chalcidius' teaching that human souls were created from substances left over from the creation of the world soul, meaning that they are mutable and that they sometimes tend towards virtue, sometimes to malice. Copied diagrams signal discussions of the best parts of the soul and of its rational and desiring forces. Annotations also highlight, as on the slide, discussions of Aristotle's views and label the definition of the soul as a self-moving, rational, and incorporeal substance as, quote, what Plato calls the soul. Conversely, various Pythagorean doctrines that Chalcidius discusses, such as reincarnation as plants or as beasts, are censored, and the annotators also show no interest in what Chalcidius says about the world soul. Such new discoveries were slow to percolate in the Carolingian scholarship. What Charlemagne's court scholar Augustine taught in his De Ratione Anime, written around 800, is best understood in the context of Carolingian theological preoccupations. Alcuin, in the spirit of the Carolingian approach to the Fathers, which assumed that all fathers ultimately testified to one unified truth, produced a synthesis of patristic teachings on the soul, predominantly those of Augustine and Gregory. Alcuin's soul is predominantly the image of God, and as such, the moral center of the individual. Perhaps consequently, although Alcuin says that the soul is incorporeal, he also teaches that it is circumscribed by the body. Thus, no potential dissociation from the body threatens its status as the governor of the body. Alcuin's work bears mentioning because it was disseminated almost as the official Carolingian teaching on the soul. It was packaged together with Alcuin's De Fide Sancte Trinitatis and a short, more basic questionnaire on the Trinity, clearly to provide an account of the image of Trinity in man to complement the account of the triune God. The surviving number of 9th century manuscripts of the package shows that it was quickly and widely transmitted. However, the effect of the new discoveries of philosophical texts is already palpable in the works of some of Alcuin's students. His student who followed him as the head of Charlemagne's palace school after his retirement in 796, Fridugius, applied Porphyry's and Boethius's ideas on language and the Aristotelian categories in a rather singular treatise where he attempted to prove that the words nothing and darkness have real reference. With darkness, he deals using the categories, seeking to show that the Bible applies the categories to darkness. As something to which the categories applies, darkness is then shown to be a corporeal thing. In contrast, nothing is not corporeal, so the categories do not apply. Instead, Fridugius argues that nothing is a thing because we can construct sentences about it. He takes a model he finds in Boethius's first commentary to Aristotle's Perihermeneios, where a word refers to a concept in the mind, which then refers to an existing thing, and effectively conflates the mental concept with the existing thing. Observing, moreover, that the Bible teaches us that the elements and the soul were created out of nothing, nothing surely is something great and incomprehensible, since we cannot fully understand even the things created out of it. Candidus Viso was another idiosyncratic student of Alcuin's. He touches on the soul in a letter he wrote to a junior colleague who had asked him about the possibility of seeing God. Candidus began by defining God as an altogether incorporeal spirit, and then contrasting this with the nature of angels and souls. These, he says, are said to be and are incorporeal, but in comparison with God, they are corporeal. Moreover, as spirits, they might be called non-local, but they are contained by the world, whereas the world is contained by God. Candidus seems to have been concerned to establish a clear distinction between God and the soul to better serve his wider thesis that God not only cannot be seen, but that there is also a limit to the extent to which he can be perceived through the spirit intellectually. It needs to be noted that Candidus was clearly cognizant of discourses on the immateriality and non-locality of the soul, and gave them more conceptual space than Alcuin did. His master was content to limit the soul's incorporeality within the boundaries of the body, while Candidus limited it to the world, suggesting that he was, after all, more prepared to entertain the soul's strong incorporeality. Charlemagne's reign was a time of such experimental synthesis between received and newly discovered notions of the soul. Yet the basic tension between intellectual visions of a wholly immaterial soul and pastoral and social commitments never went away. From the 5th century, the problems with the immateriality of the soul from a pastoral perspective was that it was too ephemeral. If it did not unequivocally sit in the body, how could it control the body as it should to act morally? And more seriously, How could an immaterial soul retain its individuality after death and inhabit spaces of torment or repose, as it should, to reap the wages of its actions? Both ideas threatened the basis of Carolingian state morality, the idea that everybody, especially in royal office, would seek to act morally and loyally or risk suffering the consequences in the hereafter. This basic tension between philosophical theology and social ideals had been in place long before the Carolingian period, but in the 9th century it was sharpened. At the turn of the 840s, the Carolingian kingdoms had suffered a traumatic civil war among the sons of Emperor Louis the Pious, and it was widely diagnosed as a moral crisis, specifically a crisis of fidelity. Moreover, in the late 840s, one Gottschalk of Orbais went around the empire preaching so-called double predestination, the idea that God had predestined everybody to either salvation or damnation. Bishops quickly deemed such teaching a threat to public order, as it could be understood to mean that individual actions did not matter. The predestination controversy endured throughout the 850s, despite the quick condemnation and imprisonment of Gottschalk, not least because he was evidently able to correspond despite his monastic confinement, and the relevant questions evidently captivated the minds of lower clergy and monks. It seems likely that all of this electrified the concept of individual agency and accountability in new ways and contributed to the nature of the soul also becoming into discussion. And this is my final case. The nature of the soul was discussed apparently in the early 850s, perhaps just after the condemnation of Gottschalk at Kierzy in 849. These discussions are known through three texts: the so-called Responsa de Diversis by Gottschalk, the Diversa et multiplici anime ratione, printed in the 17th century among the words of Hincmar of Reims, and De Anima by Ratramnus of Corbie. The latter two texts survive in their entirety, but a substantial chunk of Gottschalk's treatise is lost, so that we can only see from his list of chapters that he discussed various matters related to these other two treatises, but we don't know what he said. Yet there are hints that the controversy may have been wider. While the text attributed to Hincmar addresses King Charles the Bald, it is not at all certain that the superior that Ratramnus wrote to was also the king. Moreover, since Gottschalk's Responsa collects and synthesizes short letters and treatises that he circulated among his supporters, the fact that it once contained material relevant to this discussion suggests these were also issues that interested his monastic correspondence. The surviving texts show that the debate or discussion involved a related set of questions about the meaning and implications of the incorporeality of the soul. As I noted, these had been unclear since the 5th century, and the early Carolingian syntheses did not really resolve the matter. The questions suggest familiarity with the discussion between Faustus and Claudianus, although it may be, as Gerard Mathon suggested once, that Faustus and other 5th century authors critical of Augustine's views would have received new attention during the mid-9th century controversy over double predestination, and that the discussion may in fact have arisen due to wider familiarity in learned circles with these texts. It in fact seems that Claudianus Mamertus's De Statu Anime and its rediscovery in these years better explains this discussion. For every surviving copy of that work also includes an excerpt from Faustus's letter 3 that lays out the reasoning behind his views on the soul's corporeality. Moreover, circumscription, an important concept in the discussion, was not one used in the 5th century debates, but instead probably comes from Gregory the Great, who, as we just heard, did use it to characterize the soul. The relative sequence of these writings is also uncertain. At some point, Charles the Bold commissioned an expert opinion from the author of De Diversa. However, its author was clearly aware of positions like those argued by Ratramnus, and although he may not have been reacting precisely to Ratramnus, it makes sense to begin with Ratramnus's arguments. Ratramnus sought to respond to a recipient who had asked him to explain, by the authority of ecclesiastical writers, whether the soul is circumscribed and whether it is localized. He begins by discussing terminology. The philosophical meaning of a circumscribed thing is that which is not everywhere, but is enclosed within certain limits. God alone is fully uncircumscribed, while everything created is circumscribed, distinguished from other things through their own qualities. Yet while the soul is circumscribed in this sense, it is not a material thing, and it is not circumscribed by material boundaries. As for locality, everything that is in place is divisible, and with such things, the whole is larger than any of the parts. But the soul cannot be divided in this way, and it is thus not composed of parts. And it is not possible to say that the whole soul is bigger than its parts, or that a part of the soul is smaller than the whole. Such definitions belong to corporeal things. The soul, however, is not a material thing, and therefore is non-local. Ratramnus's arguments are clearly inspired by Claudianus Mamertus, whom he cites, and whose interpretation of the soul he proceeds to read into the other authorities he cites. He proceeds to cite Augustine and Gregory and Isidorus and all of these, and basically implies that they all agree with Claudianus. Ratramnus was not alone. A similar systematic reading of patristic ideas about the soul can be found in the Florilegium compiled by Hadoard, his brother monk at Corbie. What is less clear, because of our incomplete understanding of the polemical context, is why these ideas were important to Ratramnus. The most probable answer is, given his evident learning in dialectics and the philosophical texts of late antiquity, seen in this treatise and his other works, is that he was convinced of the utility of philosophy for Christian theology, and probably also felt that the soul's immateriality best explained its intellectual properties and its relationship with God. The author of De Diversa had different concerns and different methods. If he was not Hincmar, his preoccupations were still rather obviously those of a Carolingian bishop. I focus here on his answers to two of the questions he dealt with, the two that are most comparable with those discussed by Ratramnus. We shall see that he was very interested in showing that the soul is securely located in the body. The author defines the soul as a spirit by nature, simple when compared with the body that consists of the four elements, multiple when compared with God, because it is subject to many passions. Addressing the second question, whether the soul is localized, he notes that such characterizations do not apply to spiritual things like the soul. However, he continues, the Bible teaches us that the soul, although a spirit, is in a wonderful and ineffable way contained by the body. After biblical quotations to support this statement, the author provides quotations from the fathers, beginning with Ambrose and continuing to Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, and Cassiodorus. In his quotations, the author is mainly concerned with figures of speech, such as the body as the clothing of the soul, and then reads them literally to show that the fathers locate the soul in the body. The author of the De Diversa follows above all Gregory the Great, whom he quotes, on how the soul, although incorporeal, is in the body and therefore localized because it is kept in corporeal spaces. That the embodiment of the soul was the author's main concern is also indicated by his treatment of the third question he discusses, namely whether the soul moves locally with the body. He notes that it is the soul that moves the body, and not the other way around, but that obviously when the body moves, the soul that wonderfully vivifies it also follows. For if the soul which gives life to the body was left behind, surely the body would not be able to move. He adds that the fathers teach us that the soul is circumscribed, like angels are, and quotes Gregory's Moralia as proof of this. In the author's protestation that the soul which did not move in space with the body it moved, that the soul which did not move in space with the body that it moved would be left behind, we can glimpse one of the anxieties behind the opposition to the soul's full immateriality. Clearly, it was hard to imagine that such a soul could control its body. To the author of De Diversa, the non-corporeality of the soul was relative. While the soul is correctly regarded as not corporeal, when compared with God's nature, all creation is corporeal, he says. He avoids using terminology related to the philosophical systems integrated by Augustine or Claudianus. Instead, he approaches the soul from the point of view of biblical anthropology. On the soul-body connection, he argues a thoroughly Augustinian notion, namely that the connection is mysterious, but the material he assembles also tends towards affirming that the soul is enclosed by the body. Clearly, the spirituality of the soul did not mean that it was incorporeal in the sense that Claudianus or Ratramnus understood. The author of De Diversa was concerned to establish that the soul is in the body. He seems to have been aware of the kinds of ideas that Ratramnus argued, but less interested in understanding them. At one point, he impassionately demands that those who believe that the soul is not contained by the body should be excommunicated. This shows that he felt that the idea was dangerous, most probably because it could be seen as denying individual agency and therefore responsibility. The mid-9th century debates do not seem to have solved questions about the nature of the soul, but these two texts usefully reveal what was important about the soul's nature in different contexts and the different authors. My study extends only to the end of the 9th century. The following centuries are in one sense unknown terrain. The canon, such as it is, for discussing the intellectual history of the soul, often contains no early medieval Latin thinkers, leaping from Augustine to Albert the Great, as for example in John Haldane's survey in the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. Nevertheless, it seems to be that these two main opinions, a philosophically grounded view of the soul as truly immaterial, and a pastorally and socially relevant view of its relative incorporeality, remained the two main opinions for defining the soul even beyond the 9th century. The former gained momentum with the deepening study of Neoplatonist writings, and especially after discovery in the second half of the 10th century of the rest of Boethus' Aristotelian commentaries and textbooks. At the same time, the social and pastoral concerns that required the soul to be credibly governing the body and to undergo punishments did not go away, and the way of accommodating them likely remained, limiting the soul's incorporeality in some way. As much is also suggested by the work of Jérôme Basquiat, who surveyed the soul-body relationship and its social ramifications in the Central and later Middle Ages. He identifies a process where the incorporeality and therefore the separation of the spiritual, including but not limited to the soul, was emphasized by certain actors and minimized by others. He sees it particularly reflected in social dynamics, especially in the church, where the faithful were the body and the clergy, figuring Christ, represented its head and soul. Thus, stricter incorporeality would have been important for those arguing for the special position of the clergy. The Gregorian reforms in the 11th century emphasized the separate and consequently higher status of the spiritual, while also embracing community. The right relationship between the body and the soul was ever moving, liable to be challenged by anti-clericalists to the corporealizing direction, and or ecclesiastical movements pretending to a special sanctity to the opposite direction. Similarly to what obtained already in the Carolingian situation, Basket suggests that spiritualizing dualism was probably more dangerous to social order, not least because the church was invested and engaged in spiritualizing material things, starting with but not limited to the relics of the saints. Thus, it appears to me that the two views that I have sketched, immateriality and relative incorporeality, truly did remain in place up to the 12th century Aristotelian translations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. I promised a lot. You delivered even more. The soul of your presentation was not thin. It was definitely material. It contained a lot of material as pre-mortal rewards for your audience. And I think it raised a lot of questions and points of discussion, and I hope you want to answer to them. And there's already Nena.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed the panorama. I have 3 questions or remarks. I think all of them are easy, but I'm just curious. First one, very straightforward. Perhaps I missed it, but what would you say about Tertullian's treatise on the anima? Second is just a remark I had. So the question of incorporeality of the soul, of course, it's linked to Christianity. But then it can also be linked, especially in the antiquity and late antiquity, early Middle Ages, late antiquity, more like it, as a reaction to Stoic ontology, who they consider soul as being corporeal. And you have Stoic sources that Chalcidius discusses. And you have even Augustine, who has still the notion of rationes seminales and logoi spermatigoi, which is still a corporeal thing. So just to say, there's another strand, also incorporeality as a reaction to Stoic ontology. That's my second remark. And then third is just me thinking about a very silly terminological question. So I know that Lucretius, who wasn't discovered until the 15th century, but he discusses 2 words for the soul. So he has animus and he has anima, and he distinguishes between them. So that's just, I was curious, because you're the expert on this. Do they, especially in the early periods, do they still sometimes juxtapose anima and animus, or is it always just anima? Thank you.
Thank you. So this was, I'll try to be brief. Tertullian, as you probably know, the whole text survives through one Carolingian manuscript. So that tells us that at least Lytra, the Bishop of Lyon, who owned that manuscript, knew of the text at the very least. Who else did? We don't know. It's clear that Augustine particularly criticizes Tertullian heavily, does not like his views on the soul, says so very, very clearly, and the early medieval readers of his works notice this. So it may be that nobody was interested in Tertullian because Augustine didn't like it. But whether that was actually the case, it's not easy to say. I don't know that any of my works directly or indirectly in a way that I would notice cite him or reflect him. And I'll take Lucretius second, because Lucretius also was read by Carolingians. The earliest manuscripts of his works are Carolingian, but as far as we can tell, they were interested in his meter. They read him as poetry. There's marginally more evidence that some of the noticed things that he said about the soul, but not much more than there is of the Italians' views. And then Stoic influence. Yes, you're absolutely correct. In the late antique context, the Neoplatonists argue with the Stoic notions, and in the case of Augustine, incorporate some of them. But that antagonism disappears with the disappearance of the late antique philosophical world. And what I've been calling the pastoral Christian concerns are that's the camp, if we use that kind of definition, that uses some ideas that could be called Stoic or Stoicizing, but they don't think they are doing that. They don't know about the Stoics. But some of the ideas that some of the older literature calls Stoicizing notions survive through these Christian concerns.
Thank you very much. It was a really clear and very interesting talk, and you have very beautiful manuscripts, so that must be a pleasure to work on. I can only say that the first conclusion here must be right, because I know so very little about it. I work on the later period, so the later Middle Ages. And so I had two questions. One is about reception, so a more historical question, and the other is a little more philosophical. The historical, you said that there was I can't remember the word you used, but a reintroduction of these philosophical texts in the Carolingian period. So is it the case then that Augustine was just the overwhelming presence until then, and then suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, they were rereading people like Boethius, whom I would have thought was a little more present there? So I was wondering whether you would say something about that. And then I was also curious, and this kind of follows up on something Nana was saying about what's the distinction between immateriality and incorporeality? Do they make that? Is it in Latin? Because this will become standard. Normally it's linked to the Jewish philosopher. Sorry, my brain isn't working very well. Yeah, so the spiritual matter, right? And there's a definite distinction between materiality and corporeality, and it's an attempt, of course, to answer some of the issues that you were bringing up about how God is distinct from creatures and things. So do they actually make that distinction, or is that something that is it in the Latin there that you're looking at? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. First, the issue of transmission. Yes, in my presentation, I skipped basically from Gregory to the Carolingians with a brief interlude with the Visio Baronti. There's all kinds of things going on in the period. Some scholars during that time clearly read Augustine, clearly appreciating some of the philosophical dimensions of what Augustine says. It seems that somebody somewhere, probably in the 5th century, 6th century, and not later, also reads Boethius and Claudianus Mamertus and things like that. But most literate people in the period would not have read either Augustine or any of these philosophers. What they did read were these what we might call derivative works by people like Isidore of Seville and a host of anonymous authors who took these substantial works and modified their ideas for the purposes of teaching, basically, and a lot of the finer points tend to drop in this kind of process. So there are a lot of these texts that say they are transmitting Augustine's teaching, for example, and teach basically a weak, what I've been calling a weak incorporeality. So by the Carolingian period, what an educated person might know as Augustine's teaching on the matter might not be a straightforwardly answerable question. Your second question, I've already forgotten. Yes, no, it's not. It's usually not in the terminology. Everybody uses incorporeal, and it's only very recently by people like Gregory Smith and others who have noticed that the way they use this word is not consistent. They use it differently. Some of them use it. It's when Augustine explains what he means by it, that he means a thing that has no dimensions and no extension, and then we can say that he means that it's immaterial. But other people use it differently. So what I have to do then is to read in a way between the lines to see how they actually, what do they actually mean? And but the fact that they all call the soul incorporeal is clearly the root of the idea that, well, from Augustine to Albert the Great, everybody just thought the way Augustine thought soul was incorporeal.
Can I ask a question? So I have thank you first of all for the lovely lecture. I have an interest because I work later stuff, early 13th century, but I always think of the Carolingian period as kind of the beginning, or at least the proto-scholastic thing, right? With the 7 liberal arts, and well, they exist earlier, but with the sort of university setting, with the curriculum being set and so on. I was wondering, you mentioned in your presentation the Carolingian synthesis, and I was thinking, what is the essence of this Carolingian synthesis? Because it seems there are at least 3, as I understand through your talk, at least 3 different ways to conceive of the soul, right? The governator being a governor, being a separate substance with the body, and then you say with Calcidius, although not very well received, you also have now finally an idea of the soul as the form. But when you talk about the Carolingian authors, they seem to be primarily concerned with a theological synthesis, namely to understand how the soul can suffer after death, or to understand how personal responsibility can be maintained. Would you say that's a fair assessment, that the synthesis of Carolingian thought is primarily theological and not like later you would have in this classic period to conceive the soul both as a substance and as a form, like more philosophical?
Thank you. Yes, certainly it's more theological. What I mean by the Carolingian synthesis, or I'd say syntheses, are the attempts by Alcuin, probably most influentially, but some of his students as well, to sort of to somehow reintegrate this more philosophical tradition that they've clearly only become aware of fairly recently with what they've learned theologically, and basically to fit the soul's strong incorporeality with these theological concerns, and things like what Gregory raised, and they do it differently. Alcuin is clearly more traditional in terms of holding more to the things he and everybody has clearly learned, whereas Candidus, for example, probably because he's writing mainly to a fellow scholar, although semi-publicly, probably had more latitude and drew the boundaries differently. That's what I meant, and that they were both motivated, like these other contemporary authors, by these central notions related to the Carolingian Empire, this responsibility, faithfulness, yes, moral action, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
How people created their image of the world and image of the body and what a human being is. And you said that in a certain time they thought that soul has prophetic abilities due to its mobility and thinness. I wonder what do you mean by mobility? The mobility of the soul. What is that?
Yeah. 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 So yes, so this is Gregory, who's talking about, specifically talking about prophetic utterances by people who are near to death. This is the context. And it's difficult to say what he means by mobility. Now, what Gregory clearly is doing, he's taking what Augustine says when he's asked to explain how demons prophesy, and basically saying that this is how the soul might do it. So Augustine says that demons are more mobile and thinner, so that they are fast and they can report on faraway things that might come apparent only later now. But I'd say that Gregory doesn't mean mobile in space in that way. Probably mobile intellectually, or mobile in terms of connection with God, I'd wager. But it's very short. It's sort of an offhand thing. It's not at all clear what he means by it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. The authors you discussed, do they link the question about the nature of the soul to the question about the motion of the celestial bodies? So do they see the soul as a substance moving the celestial bodies?
Chalcidius does, as he would as a Platonist. But as far as I can say, the early medieval readers of Chalcidius did not. That they weren't really interested in the whole notion. Well, they clearly weren't interested in the notion of world soul, which is sort of the most important of these embodied movers in the Platonic system. And there's even a extant discussion from the mid-9th century where Ratramnus, the guy we met in my last discussion, has been called by a bishop to correct a unnamed scholar who has thought that there is a world soul, and even thinks that Augustine thought that there was a world soul. And and the discussion has clearly been going on for a while until the text that is extant, where Ratramnus then argues that this is not the case. So no, it doesn't seem to be. Although I still don't, because it is something that does come up, probably comes up eventually when the medieval study of Platonism deepens, and it might already come in the late 9th and early 10th century commentaries to some of the texts that they discovered in the early 9th century. So it might come up there.
Thank you for the presentation. I will ask also if it's maybe possible to have the slides. I couldn't take note of everything. But I have one curiosity about the Macrobius commentary on Cicero's dream of Scipio. How much is important this text? Because along with the Chalcidius translation is one of the few sources of Plato during this period, and if there is a link about the narratives of the afterlife, so if there is a link between Macrobius and the Visiones about the narrative, both from a philosophical as a philosophical source and a model for the narratives of these Visiones.
Yes, thank you. So as I said, they seem to have discovered or the first context where we can see that somebody knows Macrobius is actually Theodulf's response to the Second Council of Nicaea, where when he argues that the stories of dreams that the Council Fathers have brought in as testimony to the efficacy of images shouldn't be taken into account. Somebody's written in a contemporary hand writes in the margin, add Macrobius's discussion with this. So they knew it, but as I said, some of this knowledge seems to percolate slowly into the more general discussion, and so it's from the late 9th century onwards then that we find more familiarity with Macrobius. Whether it influenced some of the vision accounts, I would say that it didn't up to the 9th century, that the vision accounts up to that point at least followed earlier models, but possibly later. And I know that it is a question that has been discussed.
I want to remind you that the talk was recorded, and we're obviously looking forward to reading Jesse's book, who will be published with Cambridge University Press in the coming months, I suppose.
Eventually.
A final question that bridges that forms a bridge to the next talk. What would you think was the most provocative aspect of Aristotelian psychology for people trained in this tradition once the text of De Anima became available in Latin?
Well, the issue of embodiment is one. Well, from the way Chalcidius reads Aristotle, he's bothered by the way he understands Aristotelian idea as a soul, and clearly seems to think that it's embodied in a wrong way, or is a too corporeal thing, and so that would be one, but but aside from these questions that animated people that they disagreed on, I think the most provocative idea would be that the soul doesn't survive the body.
Thanks. Maybe we'll get an answer to the question in 4 weeks, because the next FITMA lecture will be on the 12th of March, not in this room, not at this time. It will be in the afternoon, probably in room C, once we get confirmation for that, eventually, as you said. And then we'll have Michele Meroni, who will talk about 13th century reception of some problematic ideas from De Anima. I want to thank Jesse, I think we all do, for this great start of the series of lectures. Thank you very much.